Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson rests in the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. If you have just arrived and are looking for a seat, please rest assured there is an aisle in the middle, so you won't have to push past anybody. Thank you all so very much for joining us here. We are here to celebrate Scoundrels and Shirkers, Capitalism and Poverty in Britain, the latest book by Jim Silver, to which you may uproariously applaud. It's always a particular pleasure to launch a book here for Jim at the store, and I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us. I will begin with a note of apology. The wonderful thing about this time of the year is that we do have warm weather. However, that also brings the sun with it. So it will be your nemesis for a short period of time throughout the evening, but rest assured it will pass on to antagonize somebody else momentarily. So thank you so very much for your forbearance, and apologies to your eyes. We are so grateful to Fernwood, not only for being such an incredible partner, but for continuing to publish such important and fascinating books, such as Jim's and many of Jim's over the years. You'll be hearing from somebody from Fernwood in just a moment. But before that takes place, I just have a few very quick housekeeping notes. So there'll be an introduction, followed by a presentation from Jim here at the podium. Immediately following the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you people to ask questions. If you do have a question, please just raise your hand and I'll run over to you with the microphone, which is not a comment on your ability to project, but just ensures that people can actually hear your question on the live stream. If you are one of those people joining us on the live stream, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat, and we will put them to Jim as time permits. I'll be back at the close of the evening with some procedure regarding signing, and just to let you know how you can get a copy of the book signed. But the only thing I will put in your brains right now is that we will ask you just to remain in your seats for one quick second while we move Jim over to the signing table at the end of the event, and I'll have more details for you at the close. Other than that, it's my great pleasure to introduce the person who will be introducing Jim this evening. Wayne Antony is a publisher at Fernwood Publishing. He is a founding member of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba and a board member since its inception in 1997. He's worked with other Winnipeg political activist organizations, the Socialist Education Centre and Thin Ice. Wayne also taught sociology at the University of Winnipeg for 18 years. He is co-author of 3 reports on the state of public services in Manitoba and co-editor of 6 editions of Power and Resistance, Critical Thinking About Canadian Social Issues, co-editor of Citizens or Consumers, Social Policy in a Market Society, and Capitalism Rebooted, Work and Welfare in the New Economy, both with Dave Broad, and co-editor with Julie Gard of Bankruptcies and Bailouts. Please join me in welcoming Wayne Antony.
Wow, this is the second time in the last few weeks being in this space again and doing a book launch with people instead of screens. Really amazing, and thanks for all of you for showing up tonight to help us celebrate the launch of Scoundrels Shirkers and Scoundrels by Jim Silver. Thanks to McNally Robinson for this great space to have an event like this, and for all the years. I can't say enough about McNally Robinson. The support they've given Fernwood, independent publishers in Manitoba, they've just been crucial, helping us reach people who want to read. Thanks as well to John and Sana Awani, who's the promotion manager at Fernwood, for organizing tonight. And also finally, thanks to the Manitoba Research Alliance. They've supported this book. They've supported several books that Fernwood is involved in. And their support of that research, those authors, and Fernwood is really appreciated. So this is the 14th book that I've had the pleasure of editing and publishing with Jim. It boggles my mind. 14 books. That's amazing. The first one was in 1996, 24 years ago. Thin ice. It's been a long journey. It's been a great journey. I'm not going to say a lot about this book, Scoundrels and Shirkers. Jim will tell you more about it, but I think it's kind of I was going to say culmination, but I don't want to say that because that sounds like an ending. More like the bringing together, I think, of decades of Jim's activism, research, and writing. He's been trying to figure out over many decades, figure out poverty, its nature, its impacts, its causes, what can be done about it. And this particular book looks at 8 centuries of history in the, I guess, prototype industrial capitalist society. And it brings together just an astounding breadth and depth of research and knowledge. And I think I'll just digress a bit here. An indication of the breadth of that knowledge is that Jim won an award for scholarly publishing for this particular book, which I also find kind of interesting because unlike a lot of the books that are supported by scholarly publishing, this is actually readable. I think most people will understand what Jim has to say. And poverty has of course been integral part of that 800 years of history. And there's many significant elements to that 800 years, but one that really stuck with me and working with Jim on this book is the tenacity with which the view that the poor are the cause of their own poverty, that view has remained stuck for 800 years through feudalism and all the twists and turns of capitalism. The poor have always been the cause of their own poverty, or seen as the cause of their poverty. Quite simply is caused by some people being scoundrels and shirkers. But at the same time, Jim shows us in this book that, well, there haven't been a lot of attempts to really get rid of poverty when there's the political will to resist that view. Some significant things can be done. So I think it's a great book, and I say on behalf of everyone at Fernwood, we're honored to publish this book. We think it's an important intervention in an equally persistent struggle for fairness in our society. And so thanks, Jim, for asking Fernwood to publish it, for your confidence in us and your loyalty to Fernwood. 14 books, geez, that's a lot of books. You could have gone anywhere else, but you stuck with us. I'd say finally, on a personal note, I mean, it's been 14 books, and Jim and I have been doing some stuff together since 1983, so it's been many decades. This book was a bit of a kind of a winding road. It had some very unusual twists and turns in its making between Jim and I, including one which I have to mention. One of the reviewers of the early manuscript told Jim that he should really include the analysis of J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy in his analysis of poverty. J.D. Vance is a very, very right-wing, blaming the poverty kind of guy. So we ignored that. No, we persisted, and As always, it was a great pleasure working with Jim. I learned a ton about the topic working with Jim. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Jim Silver.
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks everyone for being here. I've got some other thank yous that I want to make, and I'll leave those to the end and plunge right into saying something about the book. So this book, as Wayne said, examines about 800 years of history with a focus on how poverty is produced by the ordinary day-to-day operations of capitalism. I argue in the book that capitalism perpetually and necessarily produces poverty. In the opening paragraph, I write, quote, "The perpetual production of ever-changing forms of poverty is an inevitable part of the creative destruction that characterizes capitalism. The form of the poverty changes over time because capitalism is constantly changing, but there's always poverty. It's a necessary part of capitalism." Two British authors put it this way: "The single most unifying factor in working class history in Britain has been poverty. The threat of poverty, the fear of poverty, the certainty of poverty." And poverty, I argue, is about labor. It's about work or the absence of work or the particular character of work. People are poor because of their relationship to the means of production. They've been pushed off the land, or they don't have a job, or the job they have is poorly paid or part-time or irregular. That's been the case for centuries. That continues to be the case today. Precarious labor, which is mentioned frequently today as if it's a new phenomenon, is not a new phenomenon at all. Precarious labor has been the norm for centuries. And there have been constant efforts over the centuries, taking various forms, to force people into work, to force them into the dangerous and unattractive jobs that capitalists are creating. Today in Britain, these jobs often are called low pay, no future jobs. Another theme of the book, and Wayne alluded to this, is that while it's the system that creates poverty, I argue that manufactures poverty, it's capitalism that creates poverty, the blame for the poverty is always placed on the poor themselves. And more than blamed, the poor are feared, hated, reviled, punished. In the 16th and 17th centuries, they were tied to the back of carts and whipped, and their ears were cut off. In 1590, vagrants in Middlesex were being whipped and branded at the rate of one a day. Hatred and blaming of the poor can be seen in the names that are always attached to those in poverty. So the title of the book is Scoundrels and Shirkers. Also, at various times, the poor have been called social scum, diseased, degenerate, parasites, feeble-minded. During the early years of the enclosure movement, so 500, 600, 800 years ago, those tramping the roads after being forced off the land were called lawless beasts, committing heinous deeds, detestable sins, and they were the very filth and vermin of the Commonwealth. In the late 19th century, Charles Booth said about the very poor, their life is the life of savages. They degrade whatever they touch. About the Irish poor, a Liverpool physician wrote in 1845, quote, "The Irish seem to be contented amidst the dirt and filth. They merely seem to care for that which will support animal existence." More than a century later, in the late 60s and 70s, the term scoundrels became the common way to call those who were poor, and the term scoundrophobia emerged with the media attacking those living in poverty, making the claim that they were ripping off the welfare system, and that was what was the cause of poverty. In 2011, so moving up really close to today, 12 years ago, there were serious riots in Britain caused by growing levels of poverty, and the evidence is clear that the riots were poverty-related. The media coverage described those involved in the riots with such language as scum, thugs, feral rats, the scum class, verminous waste, parasitical underclass. The then conservative justice minister called the rioters our feral underclass. Now, all of this was described by one writer at the time as an explosion of hate speech directed at the poor. So the point here is that blaming and shaming and hating the poor is not just a thing of the past. It has an 800-year history, and it continues today. Yesterday, in fact, in the British Guardian, it was reported that the right wing of the Conservative Party there are blaming Britain's economic problems on slackers and idlers. So the blame is always attached to those who are poor. Another theme in the book, and Wayne alluded briefly to this as well, is that there really has never been a serious attempt in Britain to solve the problem of poverty. Poverty was the fault of the poor themselves, so fix the poor, not the real causes of poverty. And there's one important exception to that. That is the 1945 to 51 Labour governments, who in my opinion were outstanding in meeting the needs of the poor. And as far as I can see, they never used the term anti-poverty programs. Their approach was universal programs that benefited the entire working class, the National Health Service, which they pioneered in the Western world, massive amounts of good quality social housing for the working class, a National Insurance Act that paid unemployment and sickness benefits for all working people, and a dramatic reduction in the numbers of unemployed. And they did all of this under immense financial pressure, really incredible financial pressure, and massive opposition from the private sector and the British establishment. It required, in my opinion, enormous political courage to do what they did. And the result was that poverty plummeted. But this, I think, is the only real time that there was an attempt, a serious attempt, to significantly drive down the incidence of poverty. Back briefly, back to the enclosure movement, and I'm going back and forth in time deliberately because part of the case I want to make is that poverty is a constant. It doesn't matter if I'm talking about 800 years ago or 400 years ago or yesterday, poverty is a constant. By the end of the 17th century, 40% of the British population had been forced off the land as the result of the enclosure movement. Most were made poor by the process. Many made their way into cities, which were bursting at the seams. Children were amongst those most terribly affected. And I'll focus here on the effect of poverty on children, just to use them as the example, but women were affected, men were affected, everybody. London in the 18th century, quote, teemed with abandoned children. Over 1,000 a year were being left on the rubbish heaps in the streets, alleys, and other public thoroughfares of the city. They were described as infesting the streets of London. And the most common solution was that children should be put to work. For example, in 1770, it was recommended that, quote, poor children be sent at the age of 4 to workhouses. There's considerable use in their being somehow or other constantly employed, at least 12 hours a day, so that they might be habituated to constant employment. Massive numbers of children died in these workhouses. Conditions were deliberately made awful in the workhouses because that was part of the means to force people into the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. And a side effect of all of that was the mass deaths of children. London's Foundling Hospital experienced a mortality rate of 72% in the mid-18th century. At St. Luke's Workhouse in London, all 53 children under the age of 5 died, 100% of them. Death rates in the range of 50% were common in British workhouses in the decades leading up to the Industrial Revolution. And those who survived the workhouses were set to work. So in the coal mines, for example, children under the age of 10 could be found on all fours in low-ceiling mine shafts with ropes around their waists and chains between their legs, pulling heavily loaded coal carts like horses. Parents took their very young children under the age of 10, into the pits, claiming that they couldn't exist without the wages of their children. The same was the case in the cotton mills. Children were hauled off to the cotton mills when they were younger than 10 years of age. Those who were infesting the streets of London were rounded up, loaded into carts, and forcibly hauled off to the Lancashire cotton mills, where they endured unimaginable conditions. And in the book, I include many descriptions of the terrible conditions that prevailed for all working people during the Industrial Revolution. And the point of all of this, going beyond the description of it, the point is that this is what capitalism is. It produces enormous profits. It made Britain the world's leading industrial and imperial power, and it produced horrendous forms of poverty as a necessary part of the process. The poverty was an integral part of making the Industrial Revolution successful. That's what Karl Marx meant when he said, a matter of 1 million paupers in the British workhouse is as inseparable from British prosperity as the existence of 18 to 20 millions in gold in the Bank of England. That is, the production of poverty is inseparable from the creation of wealth. The same is the case with slavery, which was also necessary for capitalism's success in Britain. Britain earned massive profits from the slave trade, and those profits were an important part of what fueled the Industrial Revolution. All of Liverpool, for example, was based on the slave trade. Between 1787 and 1807, all 20 Liverpool mayors financed or owned slave ships. Between 1630 and 1807, British slave merchants bought and sold an estimated 2,500,000 Africans. The trade was enormously profitable. The massive profits produced by slavery were the result of a managerial strategy on the cotton plantations of the Deep South in America that has been described by Edward Baptiste in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, as torture. The management strategy, torture. Management by the whip. And the massive profits that were the result of that were poured into the emergent Industrial Revolution in Britain and in the United States as well. Capitalism was producing, as it does, both massive profits and horrific poverty. Slaves picked cotton under brutal conditions in the American South. Women and children processed the cotton in Lancashire mills under brutal conditions, and the sale of the resulting products caused the virtual destruction of a thriving clothing industry in India. Poverty was produced at every point in what was a global capitalist process. Sven Beckert, in his book, Empire of Cotton, has written, Slavery, colonialism, and forced labor were not aberrations in the history of capitalism. They were at its very core. Let's leap forward in time to Margaret Thatcher, who was elected Prime Minister in Britain in 1979. The British economy was lagging. She believed that the poor were the cause of the economic problems. Welfare was making the poor lazy. She was opposed to all forms of welfare. She saw herself as a Victorian, preferring the governance of the 19th century. The poor had to be forced to work, as they had been in the Victoria era, the era of the Industrial Revolution. And it's interesting that prior to becoming Prime Minister in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was one of 6 British members of Parliament, Conservative Party members, who voted in favor of the restoration of flogging for the poor. Her approach, what we now call neoliberalism, deliberately drove up unemployment, which went higher than it had been during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and deliberately drove up poverty, so that by the end of the Thatcher era, 1 in every 3 children in Britain was growing up in a family living in poverty. And she introduced workfare. So workfare is intended to force people into the lower reaches of the increasingly precarious and poorly paid labor market. That is the low pay, no future labor market. In exactly the same way as the New Poor Law of 1834 and the workhouses of the Industrial Revolution were intended to force reluctant workers into the mines and mills of the day. Tony Blair and New Labour, elected in 1997, carried on with workfare and with the harsh treatment of those on social assistance that characterized the Thatcher years. New Labour has been described as Thatcherism continued, and as Thatcher's well-behaved stepchildren, her direct progeny, and other such labels. Stuart Hall wrote that the welfare state, which had been old Labour's greatest achievement, was, quote, savaged and weakened under Mrs. Thatcher, but its wholesale destruction was to be New Labour's mission. Poverty remained high under Tony Blair and New Labour. Inequality skyrocketed even beyond the level of the Thatcher era. So this was done by the Labour Party, by New Labour. After New Labour was defeated in 2010 by the Conservatives, things only got worse. There followed, quote, the most comprehensive assault on the welfare state anyone living has yet seen. This has contributed to a massive growth in poverty. The number of children growing up in homes in poverty doubled from 2010 to 2018. A massive growth in food bank usage. Food banks were really not particularly common in 2010. By 2015, 1 million in Britain were using food banks. Today, it's almost 3 million people who are using food banks. So some things never change. Meanwhile, the wealth of the 177 British billionaires has grown tenfold since 1990. And of course, the problems continue to be blamed on the poor, who continue to be subjected to all manner of verbal abuse, scoundrels and shirkers, and worse. It's functional to demonize the poor. If the poor themselves are the cause of poverty, then there's no need to address the real causes of poverty. So what do we learn from this historical analysis? I think we learn a lot of things, but the thing I want to emphasize by way of conclusion is what was done by the one government that managed to significantly reduce poverty, and that was the Labour governments of 1945 to 51. So what did they do? Well, they brought in universal programs that benefited the entire working class. That is, not anti-poverty programs narrowly targeted at the poor. What those programs do is pull some people out of poverty and shield some people from the worst effects of the poverty, but the poverty persists. Capitalism continues to produce the poverty. To solve poverty requires bigger changes than anti-poverty programs. It requires the massive redistribution of income and wealth. Now, redistribution is key, and regrettably, social democratic parties across the Western world have largely abandoned the idea of redistribution and the idea of equality. It requires universal social programs that support all working people, not just the poor. It requires putting people to work, doing the many things that need doing, and paying them a living wage with benefits. And it requires that all of this be paid for by a progressive tax system that particularly taxes those who are now accumulating ridiculous, indefensible amounts of wealth. And it requires the political courage to do these things, because opposition by capitalists and their supporters will be fierce. It is true that poverty today is not as horrific as it was in the past. British children don't work in the pits at ages 7 and 8. We don't whip or cut the ears off the poor, and we don't hang children until they're dead when they pickpocket or steal food from a grocery store. But here in Winnipeg, we have people living in bus shelters and on riverbanks. Some things never change. Poverty is now overwhelming in Britain, and there's no sign of a change that I can see. If Labour is elected with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, as now looks likely, they will govern in a way that Tony Blair and New Labour governed. That is, there will be no massive redistribution of income and wealth, no public spending on universal social programs that benefit all working people, no putting large numbers of people to work doing what needs doing, and no taxing those with massive amounts of wealth. This will mean that as far as poverty is concerned, nothing will significantly change. Poverty has served capitalism well for centuries. So capitalism and capitalists will continue to produce ever more poverty until we organize ourselves to stop that. So I think I'll stop there. There will be an opportunity for questions, but I'd like to just thank a few people. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. It includes 3 of my daughters, who I'm happy to see here, and a 4th is on her way. She had rehearsal tonight. I have 1, 2, 3 of my grandsons here. Happy to see you guys. Thanks for coming. I have 2 cousins at the back, Diane and John, and Diane's husband, Norm. Thanks you guys for coming. Another extended family on this little machine here that's sending this out online. Most of the guys from my book club are here. These are guys that I have known for, in some cases, more than 60 years, and we still enjoy each other's company. We had a really good book club meeting yesterday, a book about Haiti. And a number of very close friends who are here tonight. So thanks to all of you for being here. I want to acknowledge the many terrific people that I've had the pleasure of working with for more than 25 years in Winnipeg's inner city, people who really understand poverty and are fabulous in the work they do, and from whom I feel as if I've learned an awful lot. Thanks to Molly McCracken and all the wonderful people at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Manitoba, where I've been involved since the inception of CCPA in 1997. Thanks to Shauna McKinnon and all the equally wonderful people at the Manitoba Research Alliance, where I've also been involved since its inception in the early 2000s. Thanks, acknowledgement to the late Leo Panich, who read the manuscript just before he died, and who said it was great, and who really supported its publication. And I very much wish that Leo could be here to see the final product. Thanks to Henry Heller. Early on in this work, I sent a draft of the manuscript to Henry. Not, like I hadn't written anything like this before, and I didn't know if there was anything there, and he was extremely positive and encouraging. So I'm grateful to you, Henry, for that, and especially to Wayne Antony, longtime publisher of Fernwood and longtime good friend, literally without whom this book wouldn't have seen the light of day. So thanks to all of you. And I'm happy to try to respond to questions or comments or disagreements or whatever.
Just a reminder that if you do have a question, please feel free to put your hand up and I'll come to you with a microphone. If you're watching online, just write your question in the chat.
Jim, I wonder if you could, you said several times that poverty is a necessity to capitalism. Could you elucidate that? Could you explain why the poor are structurally necessary to capitalism as a system?
Well, yeah. Capitalism is a competitive economic system. Capitalists compete with other capitalists, and in competing drive their labor costs down, particularly labor costs. So the lower you can drive the labor costs, the better. So British capitalism benefited enormously from the poverty of children and women and men in the coal mines and the cotton mills. But I think also just the logic of the profit system. Capitalism produces enormous wealth. Where does that wealth go? Where is it invested? It is invested wherever capitalists think it's going to make the greatest profit. It is not invested where the greatest need arises. An example of that is that a fundamental part of capitalism over 800 years is that working people have endured terrible housing conditions. And there's descriptions in the book of really like appalling housing conditions. So with the massive wealth that capitalism was making, you would think, well, they'd invest some of the money to produce decent housing for working people. No, there were other more profitable uses for the wealth that had been created. And so the logic of capitalism, it seems to me, necessitates the production of poverty.
Thanks for the talk, Jim, and for writing the book. My question, 800 years of persistent poverty as a structural requirement for capitalism is kind of depressing news, but not super surprising. But I think I agree with you that there was only that very short period in the UK where anyone did anything serious about it. But I wonder if in researching the book, you noticed whether there was any kind of fluctuation or change over the 800-year period in the kind of cultural traction of the idea that the poor are responsible for their own poverty. Has that remained, more or less consistent? I think in terms of just even my own extremely short blip of getting longer, but shortish blip of a life. I seem to think that I've seen fluctuations in the degree to which there's a cultural traction for that idea. Is there variation that you see? Is there pushback against it from below that is at times more powerful than at other times?
Yeah, there's been interesting stuff written that shows that, for example, when the rate of unemployment goes up, newspaper coverage of the poor gets angrier. When poverty deepens, the blame directed at the poor is aggravated and accentuated. So I think it does go, that blaming and shaming and punishing of the poor does go up and down, and it sort of goes up and down inversely with the condition of the economy.
Jim, thanks for doing the work for the last 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. You've made a huge impact in Winnipeg. I wonder what you could share. You've mentioned two things, but people living in the bus shacks and on riverbanks. What other things have you observed, and what perceptions can you share with us about what was done in Britain and what's being done in Canada to keep the systems in place?
Well, I have spent more than 25 years working in the inner city in Winnipeg and working with community organizations on poverty-related matters, working with people who are quite fabulous and with organizations that are really, really effective. And I've previously written about many of those people and those organizations. And I think, you know, Winnipeg has an inner city that is really devastated by poverty and all the complex problems related to poverty. But I wrote this book in part because, as wonderful as I think these community-based organizations are, we're not getting anywhere. We're not solving the problem of poverty. What we're doing, what those organizations are doing, is pulling some people out of poverty, shielding some people from the worst effects of the poverty, but the system continues to produce the poverty. If we go on in the way that we are today, then 25 years from now, 50 years from now, it'll be the same, if not worse. So that, you know, became extremely frustrating to me, as I know it is to many, many other people. And I, you know, which is what led me to examine the case of Britain, and leads me to conclude that those community-based efforts are simply not enough, and that we need to elect governments that are prepared to do bigger things and that have the courage to do bigger things, like massively redistribute income and introduce universal social programs. Universal programs, because programs that are targeted at the poor are always vulnerable. They don't have enough public support, whereas universal programs have broad support of working people, right? Medicare in Canada has, however battered it may be at the moment, has the broad support of the Canadian public. It's a universal program. So I think we need to move, if we are to seriously deal with this problem, we need to move to those bigger solutions: redistribution, universal programs, a progressive tax system, you know, which has been so seriously eroded. And I think all of that is predicated upon removing the false belief that the poor are to blame for their poverty. As long as we continue as a culture to believe that people are poor because of their moral failings or because of their, their bad behavior, then we're not going to do anything. We're not going to take the bigger steps that I think need to be taken. So some big changes need to be made if poverty is actually to be driven down in the way that the Labour governments of the immediate post-war period did, in fact. So it's possible.
Jim? Oh, it's there now. It's all right. That's fine. Yeah.
Jim, I was wondering if you have a view of how perhaps guaranteed annual income could fit into the solution.
I knew you'd ask that question. I was hoping you wouldn't come. No, well, the idea of a guaranteed annual income is a hotly debated topic in Canada today. I think my own personal view of the merits of a guaranteed annual income have been becoming more positive. I'm more positively inclined, I think. I'm not sold on the idea quite yet. I think for a lot of people who are poor, the guaranteed annual income would solve their problems. We have huge numbers of people who are among the working poor. They're hardworking people, but they're being paid poorly, or they're working part-time or working several jobs. A guaranteed annual income would create a floor that would benefit those people and move them out of poverty. But if we introduced what would have to be a very expensive program, the guaranteed annual income, and if we paid for it in the way that the Fraser Institute wants us to pay for it, by eliminating all the other social programs, then it's those who are caught in the complex poverty of the inner city who would suffer. I think that their solution requires more than simply an increase in their income. They're trapped in some really difficult situations. So if we could have a guaranteed annual income plus some other stuff, then I think that would be a step forward.
Jim, have you ever considered making some comments about how China in 42 years has eliminated absolute poverty with a population of over 800 million people? Do we get any clues from China?
If I were to make a comment on that, it would be, a shallow kind of comment, because I've tried to immerse myself in the history of Britain. And so I feel some confidence in saying what I'm saying about Britain, but China is a particularly complex history that I'm not on top of. So I don't think I can venture an opinion on that. If they have driven down poverty in the way that you're describing, then I assume it's because they have a communist-led government that is reinvesting the wealth that they create at the bottom of the income scale. That's what I would guess to be the case.
Since they were coming up on 25 years of cutting massively back the unemployment insurance benefits that people used to have, that the program was full of money. It was kind of an annual guaranteed income for people who did seasonal work, or who did a lot of part-time work and stuff like that.
Yeah, we've gutted the employment insurance system, that's for sure. Yeah, along with many, many other programs. On the other hand, the Child Canada benefit has helped a lot of people. It's sort of a form of a guaranteed annual income for parents with young children.
You found in 800 years, 6 years of political courage, a critical mass of political courage. You've also been reading about Haiti, and the political courage is met with ostentatious, vengeful punishment. What happened to the leaders of old labor, those leaders from 1945 to 1951, what happened to them after they were thrown out of power?
Before they were thrown out, they were completely exhausted. The policies that they put in place were massive and had a massive impact, I think. What did not happen after they left office is that they did not grow rich in the way that Tony Blair has done. So, you know, that's kind of an indication of what has happened in the shift from old labor to new labor. New labor has no social democratic character to it, whatever, as far as I can see. And Tony Blair exemplifies that, you know, he has pimped for dictators all over the world and is astonishingly wealthy as a result, and is a key advisor to Keir Starmer, who may well be the next Prime Minister of Britain. So as you say, what happens when a government tries to do the things that old Labour did from 45 to 51, they get punished. They really get pounded down. And, you know, the Conservatives, a small faction within the Conservative Party, as early as the Second World War, were mobilizing against what they saw as the emergence of left-wing ideas. That early they were mobilizing, and that manifested itself ultimately in Margaret Thatcher. They fight back. Thatcher systematically set about, for example, to destroy unions, to massively undercut union strength, and was largely successful in doing that.
Jim, you've been reasonably pessimistic about where things can go, particularly in the UK, which is what the book is mainly concerned with. But you've also put out these 5 kind of fundamental changes that have to happen in the UK here, ACES society, to do something serious about poverty. Are there glimpses of these things happening elsewhere besides UK, Canada, and whatever, that would give us some hope that if somehow we could find change makers with strength in our country or in Britain, that something can happen?
Well, I think the Nordic countries do much of what I'm suggesting needs to be done. So a strong form of social democracy is, I think, the best option that we have, and it does exist in the world in the Nordic countries. Whether that is about to emerge anywhere else in the world, I have much less confidence. You know, the old idea that those of us who are, you know, the children of the 60s, we anticipated a revolution that was going to make everything good. Right now, if there's a revolution, it will lead to fascism, where we are seeing the emergence of fascism right across the industrialized world, including in the United States, at a rate that is very, very worrisome, in my opinion. So I am quite pessimistic. To do the kinds of things that I believe need to be done to really dramatically drive down the levels of poverty would require some buildup. Colin Lees, a British political scientist, said, you know, if you're going to do these kinds of things, you need to shift people's way of thinking. You need to prepare people intellectually and culturally for these big kinds of shifts. And one of the things that we would need to do culturally is to disabuse people of the idea, the false idea, that the poor are the authors of their own misfortune. And how we can do that, that's going to be a hard one. So, regrettably, I'm fairly pessimistic.
We do have time for one more question before we turn things over to Jim for any closing comments you might have.
last question at all, but I was thinking many of your concepts are a springboard for arguments that could be made politically to whoever the mouthpieces are here, even in Canada. And that relates to the effects of reducing or eliminating poverty, actually also cleansing the massive amounts of funding that has to go into healthcare, because health degradation happens with the kind of food that people up north have to live with. Yes, that it's accessible, what percentage of budget goes. The choices, I remember when I worked in civil service for immigration, within 3 days was the average that young kids, young as 5, 7, were approached to join gangs for protection in the inner city. And I worked briefly with some of those folks when they grew up that were in Stony Mountain Penitentiary to develop business plans for growing hydroponics indoors, not cannabis, but actual vegetables. So I'm thinking of an argument even as simple as this is how much we save in healthcare costs for the treatment of people who are worn down by poverty or by bad conditions in the workplace. This is how we prevent the lack of safety, how we ensure that you are protected in your neighborhoods, in your communities, is by reducing those budgets. It's a economic kind of an argument that can be made. I haven't heard much of that or any of that, that there are we're not just the individuals that are affected by poverty, but there's so many other levels of society that we would benefit from.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you mentioned Sweden. Portugal has solved most of their addiction problems 20 years ago. Those examples are out there.
I agree entirely with what I take to be the position that you're advancing. It would be very expensive to do the things that I'm suggesting need to be done to drive down poverty, but if we were to do so, the savings would be massive, and we know that from endless studies. Poor people have shorter lifespans. Poor people use the healthcare system more. Poor people suffer all forms of medical disadvantage at a rate greater than higher income people. We know all of that. It's absolutely clear. The Manitoba Centre for Health Policy, for example, has demonstrated that over and over again. The same is the case with education. When we talk about education reform, we're always talking about things that need to be done inside the classroom. I believe that the problems with education lie outside the classroom. The correlation between low income and poor educational outcomes is clear, has been clear for decades in every country in the world. So for it to drive down poverty, educational outcomes would be improved. People who are not working would be working, and they would be paying taxes like other working people. We would benefit in that way. A great deal of crime is related to poverty, so savings could be had there as well. So I mean, this is an argument that's been made many, many times in academic literature, scholarly literature. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has hammered away at this. But again, it's a tough sell to the public.
Thank you so much, Jim. If you do have any closing comments, please feel free to offer them.
No, thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks for the really good questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. So we will move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll just bring Jim over to the signing table where he'll be happy to sign copies of his book for you. We'll just ask you to give us one moment just while we relocate him there. Books are available at the signing table itself. They're also available behind the front cash desk. So feel free to get a copy signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for a book before you physically leave. I'm so grateful to Jim. It's always such a pleasure to have him here behind a microphone. His ability to distill complex ideas down and to engage with them is always incredibly impressive and just so enjoyable to listen to. Also, from a personal perspective, it's always particularly delightful to have Stuart Hall quoted here in our atrium. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to Fernwood, and thank you to all of you. Please do applaud Jim.